Blood and authority were the twin fixations that shaped the reign of Henry VIII. As his bloated body decayed from within during the final winter days of 1547, England's most infamous ruler confronted death with the same cold calculation that had driven him to execute 2 wives and countless perceived enemies. "The lion is dying," murmured courtiers behind closed doors, "but his claws are sharp to the very end." The path to this grotesque finale began decades earlier, with a striking, athletic prince celebrated across Europe for his vitality and charm. How did this golden figure of the Renaissance become the monstrous tyrant, gasping for air in the candlelit chambers of Whitehall Palace? The answer lies not only in his notorious marriages, but in a series of medical disasters that slowly warped both his body and his mind beyond recognition. By January 1547, Henry scarcely resembled the man who had once jousted with the finest knights in Christendom. His body had become a battleground of disease, his legs ravaged by oozing ulcers that released a stench so vile that those near him struggled not to retch. He now depended on mechanical aids to shift his massive frame, which some accounts claim had swollen to nearly 400 pounds. His once attractive face grew misshapen and bloated, his eyes sinking into flesh tinged with a sickly yellow pallor. Royal physicians had exhausted their crude remedies. Bloodletting, herbal brews, and fervent prayers all failed against the cluster of ailments consuming their king. Modern scholars largely agree he suffered from type 2 diabetes, gout, and possibly osteomyelitis, a severe bone infection that would explain the relentless agony in his legs. Even more disturbing was his mental decline. His infamous temper had hardened into violent rages, broken by spells of confusion and crushing lethargy. Yet as death loomed, the politics of succession dominated the court. His third wife, Jane Seymour, had finally given him a male heir, the fragile 9-year-old Edward, but powerful factions were already scheming to control the boy once Henry was gone. Conservative Catholic forces led by the Duke of Norfolk clashed with reformist Protestants, aligned with Edward Seymour, the prince's uncle. Paranoid to the last, Henry remained painfully aware of these threats, signing execution warrants even as he struggled to grip a pen. The king's worsening condition was one of the realm's most carefully guarded secrets. Official proclamations continued to describe him as robust and vigorous, while the truth was far more horrifying. Those admitted to the royal sick room encountered a grim spectacle. The vast bed shrouded in dark fabrics, the cloying scent of decay barely concealed by clouds of incense, and at its center the immense body of a man who had once embodied England's strength. Servants whispered of hearing his screams echo through the stone corridors of Whitehall. The ulcers in his legs caused such unbearable pain that even the slightest movement could provoke spasms of agony. Physicians applied poultices made from everything imaginable, from boiled onions to powdered human skull, desperate measures that only deepened his misery. Opium offered some relief, dulling the pain but further clouding his already failing mind. The psychological torment rivaled the physical. Once the most feared man in England, whose word meant life or death, Henry now found himself powerless before the rebellion of his own body. Court records describe increasingly erratic behavior, moments of near delirium in which he babbled about the ghosts of executed rivals or called out for wives long dead. During clearer intervals, he obsessively revised his will, determined to control his dynasty's future even from the grave. Observers noted with alarm how he wavered between religious positions in these final days. Having broken with Rome to crown himself head of the Church of England, he now seemed plagued by spiritual uncertainty, demanding Catholic rites one day and reaffirming Protestant doctrine the next. His chaplain recorded that the king often woke in terror from nightmares, claiming to see the faces of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and other victims of his reign standing silently at his bedside in judgment. As his end approached, a dangerous power vacuum opened at court. The Privy Council splintered into rival camps, each maneuvering to secure influence in the coming regency. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, a survivor of decades of court intrigue, was ultimately outplayed by the Protestant faction. In a final demonstration of Henry's enduring cruelty, Norfolk was condemned to death for treason in the dying king's name, though he would escape execution only because Henry died before the sentence could be carried out. The final collapse began in late January 1547. Witnesses later reported that the king suffered a seizure so violent that attendants were forced to restrain him to prevent further injury, a harrowing sign that the end was finally at hand. When the episode finally subsided, Henry struggled to form words, his right side left partially paralyzed, unmistakable signs of what modern medicine would identify as a severe stroke. The court physicians, acutely aware that failure could mean disgrace, or even death for themselves, worked with frantic desperation to revive him. They pressed heated irons against his skin and forced bitter medicinal brews down his throat, clinging to any hope of prolonging his life. Throughout this ordeal, Access to the royal bedchamber was rigidly controlled by Henry's most trusted advisor, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. This secrecy was not merely a matter of preserving dignity. News of the king's imminent death could spark reckless power struggles or invite foreign intervention. Cranmer ensured that only the most essential attendants were admitted, each sworn to absolute silence about the monarch's condition. Even Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and surviving wife, was deliberately kept away during several critical moments. As January faded toward February, the king drifted in and out of consciousness. In fleeting intervals of clarity, he reportedly voiced mounting fear over the judgment he believed awaited him before God. The man who had ordered the deaths of 2 wives, countless nobles, and thousands of ordinary subjects now confronted his own mortality with growing terror. One attendant recorded that Henry was heard murmuring prayers and begging forgiveness in his sleep, a haunting contrast to the uncompromising autocrat who had reshaped England's religious order through sheer force of will. Court records reveal the extreme measures taken to preserve what little dignity remained in these final days. As his bodily functions failed, teams of servants rotated in shifts to manage the grim tasks of cleaning and repositioning his immense body. The ulcers on his legs had worsened so drastically that bone was said to be visible through blackened, decaying flesh. The stench became overwhelming. Perfume-soaked handkerchiefs were indispensable for anyone entering the chamber, and windows were thrown open to the freezing winter air whenever the king lost consciousness. By late February, even within the court, the elaborate fiction that Henry might recover could no longer be sustained. Cranmer was urgently summoned once more as Henry's breathing grew ragged and strained. Contemporary accounts describe how the king, unable to speak, was asked to squeeze the archbishop's hand if he placed his faith in Christ, rather than in the rituals he had once prized. With his remaining strength, Henry reportedly tightened his grip before slipping into a final coma, a moment later seized upon by Protestant chroniclers as proof of a deathbed transformation. Before dawn on January 28, 1547, the king died. Even in death, his massive body dominated the chamber, a grotesque monument to excess and prolonged suffering. The official cause was blandly recorded as natural decay, though modern analysis points to a fatal convergence of heart failure, sepsis from infected wounds, and complications consistent with advanced diabetes. More striking than the death itself was the calculated silence that followed. The Privy Council suppressed the news for 3 full days, consolidating authority around the young Edward VI. This delay proved decisive in ensuring a controlled transition of power. As Henry's body cooled in its chamber, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford and uncle to the new king, moved with ruthless efficiency. Secret councils convened, strategic strongholds were secured, and potential rivals were sidelined before the public announcement was finally made. When London's bells rang on January 31st to mark the king's passing, Seymour had already been named Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, ruling England in his nephew's name. The handling of Henry's remains posed unique challenges that reveal much about both Tudor funerary customs and the king's physical state at death. Records show that the corpse began decomposing with alarming speed, likely accelerated by the advanced infections already ravaging his body. Embalmers worked in haste, removing internal organs and packing the cavities with aromatic herbs and preservatives. Even these seasoned practitioners were reportedly shocked by what they found, particularly the diseased liver and swollen heart. A specially constructed coffin was required to contain his enormous girth, nearly twice the width of a typical noble's casket. Its sheer weight demanded a reinforced bearer and additional bearers for transport. During the lying-in state at Whitehall, witnesses later claimed that the lead-lined coffin split under pressure from gases building inside the decomposing body, allowing fluids to seep onto the chapel floor. Though swiftly concealed, accounts suggest stray dogs licked at the leakage. A final grotesque humiliation for a king obsessed with grandeur. The funeral procession to Windsor Castle on February 16th offered the Tudor regime one last chance to project Henry's authority beyond the grave. Black-draped horses drew the massive coffin through streets lined with mourners, while effigies displayed the king as he had appeared in his prime, masking the bloated, ruined figure he had become at the end. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, Henry was laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the sole wife who had given him a son and heir, and the only one spared the agony of falling from royal favour by dying from complications of childbirth before his affection could fade. The grim physical reality of Henry's decaying body stood in sharp contrast to the legend already forming around his reign. Court artists such as Hans Holbein had fashioned a lasting image of Henry as a broad-shouldered symbol of masculine authority, feet planted wide, hands on hips, staring down the viewer with defiance. This carefully engineered vision bore little resemblance to the disease-ravaged corpse now sealed beneath the stone floor at Windsor. Yet, It would dominate public imagination for centuries. Henry's will revealed his final effort to command the future from beyond the grave. The lengthy document precisely outlined the line of succession, first to Edward, then to Mary, daughter of his first wife Catherine of Aragon, and finally to Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. This order, briefly disrupted by the short reign of Lady Jane Grey, would ultimately unfold exactly as Henry decreed. His influence lingered through all three of his children, each ruling as Tudor monarchs before the dynasty ended with Elizabeth I's death in 1603. More immediately significant were the power structures Henry created for Edward's minority. He established a regency council of 16 men intended to govern collectively until the boy reached adulthood. This arrangement reflected Henry's deep suspicion of allowing any single noble too much sway over his heir. Yet his careful design unraveled almost instantly. Edward Seymour swiftly outmaneuvered his fellow councillors and secured the title of Lord Protector within days of Henry's death. The speed with which the king's intentions were overridden revealed the limits of authority once death removed his intimidating presence. The medical legacy of Henry's final years continues to captivate historians and physicians alike. His symptoms have been retrospectively attributed to ailments ranging from syphilis to scurvy, though the most persuasive evidence points to type 2 diabetes compounded by chronic osteomyelitis. Surviving medical notes describe increasingly desperate treatments, from placing halved live pigeons on his festering wounds to administering experimental mixtures containing gold and crushed gemstones. These costly but futile remedies highlight both the shortcomings of Tudor medicine and the extraordinary measures taken for a patient of such rank. Perhaps the most striking discoveries came from the personal belongings found in Henry's chambers after his death. Amid the expected emblems of power, jeweled daggers, official seals, and state correspondence, servants uncovered a small locked chest holding more intimate items, a miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of hair believed to belong to his mother Elizabeth of York, and a child's handwritten prayer book thought to have belonged to Elizabeth before her mother's execution. These fragments of private life offer a rare glimpse of the man beneath the fearsome reputation, suggesting that even as his body and mind failed, he retained ties to memory, family, and sentiment. Henry's death triggered immediate political shifts that would shape England for generations. Conservative Catholic factions that had maintained influence during his final years were swiftly sidelined as Edward Seymour established a firmly Protestant regency. The archbishop who had attended the king's final moments now accelerated reforms Henry himself had pursued cautiously. Within 2 years, the first English Book of Common Prayer was issued, pushing the nation further toward Protestant doctrine than Henry had ever intended. Henry's religious position left a deeply ambiguous legacy. He had severed ties with Rome while preserving many Catholic doctrines, allowing opposing factions to claim him as their own. Protestants emphasized his rejection of papal authority, while Catholics pointed to his defense of traditional beliefs and hostility toward Lutheran theology. This unresolved tension fueled religious conflict throughout the reigns of all three of his children, as England lurched from Protestant reform under Edward to Catholic restoration under Mary, and finally to the balanced settlement under Elizabeth. His death also marked a pivotal moment in Tudor image-making. Decade of Cain Pateo be received, having portrayed Henry as England's bulwark against foreign threats and papal domination, royal propagandists now face the challenge of transferring that authority to a 9-year-old boy. Portraits of young Edward deliberately echoed his father's iconic pose, depicting the child with the same wide stance and assertive gaze. Court rituals reinforced continuity, requiring courtiers to bow before Edward's empty throne with the same reverence once shown to Henry himself. Beyond the halls of power, the king's passing rippled through everyday life across England. For nearly 40 years, he had stood as the living embodiment of royal authority, his moods and desires shaping governance down to the smallest local detail. His death left not only a political void, but a deep psychological one. Parish records from early 1547 reflect widespread unease about what lay ahead, noting an increase in prophetic dreams, reports of strange signs in the sky, and even alleged encounters with spirits. For a society steeped in religious meaning, the loss of such a commanding ruler carried an almost apocalyptic weight. Reactions beyond England revealed the country's complicated position in Europe. The French ambassador recorded that King Francis genuinely mourned the passing of his brother of England, despite years of rivalry and war. Emperor Charles, nephew of Catherine of Aragon, took a colder, more strategic view, quietly assessing whether a kingdom ruled by a child might be exposed to invasion or manipulation. Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry years earlier, reportedly ordered a mass for his soul, a gesture that both acknowledged Henry's importance and reaffirmed Rome's claim over his spiritual fate. The very place of Henry's death, his private chambers at Whitehall Palace, quickly became charged with grim significance. Courtiers were reluctant to enter the rooms where he had endured his final suffering, as rumours spread of strange noises and unnatural coldness. Young Edward himself is said to have refused to sleep in his father's bed, demanding new chambers instead. This lingering fear reflected the trauma experienced by those who had witnessed Henry's slow collapse, many of whom had spent their lives anticipating and appeasing his volatile will. Henry's final illness stands as one of the most thoroughly documented royal deaths in history, offering rare insight into Tudor medical practice. His physicians maintained detailed records of every treatment, preserved in part to demonstrate that nothing had been left undone. These accounts reveal a blend of ancient Galenic theory and emerging Renaissance methods, including hot cupping to draw out corrupted humours, herbal remedies drawn from classical texts, and early experiments with water treatments. Their failure to ease the king's suffering underscores the severe limits of even the most advanced medicine of the age. His obsession with how he would be remembered extended to precise instructions for his tomb, envisioned as a colossal monument dwarfing all other royal burial sites in England. The design called for 40 life-size bronze figures and a towering central structure crowned with an equestrian statue of the king himself. This extravagant plan reflected both towering ego and deep anxiety about judgment by posterity. Ironically, the monument was never completed due to cost, and the bronze intended for it was later melted down during the English Civil War, a fate that would have enraged the image-conscious monarch. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the court became a place of frantic repositioning. Some who had fallen from favour cautiously re-emerged, while former beneficiaries of royal patronage scrambled to secure new protectors. Archival letters reveal the despair of servants who suddenly found themselves dismissed after decades of tending to the king's personal needs. For many, adaptation proved impossible. Skills honed to manage Henry's explosive temper were useless in the more restrained atmosphere surrounding Edward's rule. A number of former favourites took their own lives in the months that followed, unable to survive the abrupt reversal of fortune. Perhaps most consequentially, Henry's death marked the beginning of a shift in English governance. Power slowly moved away from domination by a single absolutist ruler toward a more collective model shared between crown and nobility. As Lord Protector, Edward Seymour lacked the raw personal authority that had cowed Henry's court and was forced to rely more heavily on council consensus. Though briefly reversed during Mary's reign, this transition laid foundations that would strengthen, under Elizabeth, and eventually shape England's distinctive constitutional path. In this sense, Henry's death weakened the very absolutism he had spent a lifetime building. The king's final illness also became a subject of intense medical debate across centuries. Victorian physicians, influenced by moral interpretations of disease, emphasized syphilis, framing his suffering as punishment for excess. Early 20th century doctors shifted focus to metabolic explanations, pointing to gout and diabetes. More recent scholars have proposed complex combinations, including rare genetic disorders that could explain both physical decline and behavioral changes, as well as chronic brain damage from repeated jousting injuries in youth. Even the handling of Henry's personal belongings after his death offers telling insight into Tudor attitudes toward mortality and memory. Court inventories reveal that objects touched by the king in his final days were treated with unusual reverence. Some kept almost as sacred remnants despite official rejection of such practices. His final night garments, heavily stained by bodily decay, were ritually destroyed under close supervision, an act that combined hygiene with symbolic closure. More valuable possessions, including his extensive collection of astronomical tools and detailed maps, were carefully recorded and then either distributed according to his wishes or reserved for the education of the young king. His death placed surviving family members in delicate positions that demanded careful political maneuvering. His widow maintained a solemn public mourning, while privately moving with remarkable speed to marry the man she truly loved. A union postponed during the king's lifetime. The 9-year-old successor, king in title but firmly controlled by powerful relatives, recorded his father's passing in his journal with striking emotional distance, noting the event in formal, detached language that hinted at the limited bond between them. Meanwhile, the king's daughters faced their own dangers in the new political climate. The elder, firmly committed to her faith, grew increasingly isolated as religious reforms accelerated under the regency. The younger, still a teenager, navigated court life with extreme caution, her position made fragile by her mother's execution and lingering doubts over legitimacy. Both would one day ascend the throne as promised, but only after surviving years of peril, including rebellion, imprisonment, and constant suspicion. Accounts of the king's final hours expose the profound isolation that can accompany absolute power at the moment of death. Though surrounded by attendants, physicians, and clergy, contemporary sources suggest he faced the end in near solitude, separated from others by status, and by the deeply personal nature of dying. Efforts at spiritual comfort received little response beyond a final, weak gesture. The ruler who had commanded unquestioning obedience ultimately crossed the final threshold alone, a stark reminder of mortality's leveling force. The year following his death revealed how completely his personality had dominated the machinery of government. Records show a backlog of unresolved matters that had waited for his direct approval, issues that might otherwise have been handled by subordinates, but were elevated due to a culture of absolute deference. Under the Regency, administrative systems were restructured out of necessity to function without constant royal intervention. Though chaotic at first, this transition ultimately strengthened institutional governance, allowing bureaucracy to operate with greater independence. His elaborate funeral procession became his final appearance in the public theatre of power. Contemporary observers described black-draped horses, heralds carrying ceremonial arms, and a life-sized wax effigy of the king dressed in full regalia placed atop the coffin. This artificial body concealed the decaying reality beneath as the procession moved slowly from London to Windsor over several days, allowing thousands to witness this last display of Tudor majesty. Every detail reflected deep anxiety over succession, using ritual to affirm that while a king could die, the monarchy itself endured. The physicians who had failed to save him faced uncertain futures. Some quickly secured positions with other noble households, while others suffered professional disgrace due to their association with an unsuccessful treatment. One doctor, who had dared to inform the king of his impending death when others hesitated, transformed that act of courage into continued service under the new regime. Apothecaries were subjected to particular scrutiny, with inventories of medicines supplied during the final illness closely examined for negligence, or even the suspicion of hastening the king's end. The scientific examination of Henry's remains carried out during vault renovations in the 19th century offered striking clues about his physical condition at death. Workers described uncovering an exceptionally large skeleton, consistent with accounts of his imposing stature, marked by severe degeneration in the joints, especially in the legs. Modern forensic analysis of historical medical records suggests he may have weighed close to 400 pounds at the time of his death, with a waistline exceeding 50 inches. This extreme obesity, combined with impaired circulation and the open, infected wounds noted by contemporaries, would have created ideal conditions for the sepsis that likely hastened his end. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Hiram's final days lies in what they expose about the limits of power. The ruler who transformed England's religious order, ordered the deaths of queens and nobles without hesitation, and laid the foundations of a navy that would later dominate the seas, found himself completely defenseless against the collapse of his own body. Court records describe episodes in which he lashed out at his physicians, demanding that they restore his health through sheer force of command. This futile resistance to biological reality highlights the central contradiction of absolute rule. Even the mightiest authority cannot shield the human body from illness, decay, and death. The religious uncertainty surrounding Henry's death left room for competing interpretations that served different political agendas. Protestant writers emphasized moments of supposed evangelical clarity at the end, while Catholic authors abroad portrayed a ruler haunted by regret over his separation from Rome. In reality, the evidence suggests he remained consistent in his religious stance to the last, accepting his role as supreme head of the English Church while rejecting core Protestant teachings. This position, Catholic in ritual yet defiant of papal authority, reflected his lifelong tendency to reshape institutions to suit his own needs rather than submit to external control. The economic impact of his death extended far beyond the walls of the court. Financial records show that the Regency inherited an exhausted treasury and a weakened currency. The legacy of costly foreign wars and extravagant personal spending, by some estimates, the modern equivalent of hundreds of millions, had been spent on palaces alone during his reign. This fiscal crisis forced the continuation of controversial land sales, accelerating one of the largest transfers of property ownership in English history. The economic aftershocks of this extravagance contributed to inflation and social unrest throughout the reigns of his children. Henry's physical decline also became a powerful symbol for observers of the time, many of whom viewed the king's body as a reflection of the nation itself. Drawing on medieval ideas of the ruler as the head of the body politic, writers interpreted his decaying flesh as evidence of deeper moral corruption within the realm. Sermons from the year of his death explicitly compared the infection in his legs to spiritual decay in English society. This imagery proved politically useful under the new regime, as reformers argued that just as the king's body required drastic treatment, so too did the nation's religious practices demand purification. The final days of Henry VIII mark a moment when medieval and early modern ideas of kingship collided. The elaborate rituals surrounding his death, with their focus on burial and succession, echoed ancient traditions stretching back centuries. At the same time, the detailed medical documentation, the precise legal language of his will, and the emphasis on institutional continuity reflected a more modern approach to state power. He died balanced between two worlds, the last English monarch to wield fully medieval authority, yet also a pioneer of the bureaucratic structures that would shape future governance. What ultimately makes Henry VIII's death so compelling is not only its grim physical realities or political consequences, but what it reveals about human vulnerability. The man who dominated his age through sheer force of will ended his life confronting the same limits faced by the poorest of his subjects. Contemporary accounts suggest moments of deep fear as he faced judgment not as a ruler, but simply as a man. In that final vulnerability, stripped of titles and power, England's most infamous king may have briefly shared the common human experience that had eluded him throughout his reign.